More than 6 in 10 Australian workers are currently experiencing burnout. Not occasionally stressed, not a bit tired, burned out. And according to some studies, that number could be closer to 3 in 4. What's striking, and what we're going to dig into today, is that this isn't just a personal resilience problem. It's not about who can handle the pressure and who can't. The research tells a very different story. So today, we're looking at what the latest Australian and global data tells us about burnout, who it's hitting hardest, the surprising paradoxes buried in the numbers, and what's unique about the Australian workplace context, and critically, what the evidence actually says works when it comes to addressing it. Let's get into it. Let's start with the numbers because they're pretty confronting. In Australia, 61% of workers report experiencing burnout. That's well above the global average of 48%. And a Gartner study puts the figure even higher at around 3/4 of the Australian workforce. So, in dollar terms, burnout and stress related absenteeism is estimated to cost the Australian economy around $14 billion every year. 14 billion. That's not a wellness problem, that's an economic one. But here's a statistic I find really revealing about why this is getting worse. So in 2016, employees experienced roughly 2 major workplace changes per year. By 2023, that number had risen to up to 11, nearly 1 major disruption per month. Workers simply don't have time to reset between changes before the next wave hits. And we wonder why people are burnt out. So who's most at risk? When we look at who burnout is hitting the hardest, a few patterns emerge pretty clearly. Younger workers are disproportionately affected globally. So 66% of Gen Z workers report burnout compared to 58% of millennials, 53% of Gen X, and 37% of baby boomers. So there's a clear generational gradient there. Women are also more affected than men, so 59% versus 46% globally. And in the Australian context, 61% of women who reported burnout cited balancing home and career as a significant factor, with a quarter specifically pointing to being paid less than they feel they're worth as a contributing stressor. That's not a wellness issue, that's a structural one. Mid-level employees, so those caught in the middle between leadership demands from above and team needs from below, show the highest burnout rates of any job tier. And here's the one that often gets overlooked: high performers. So we tend to assume they're fine because they're still delivering, but the research is clear. Everyone requires recovery time, regardless of how resilient they appear. High performers are often the last to flag that they're struggling, which makes them particularly vulnerable. The paradoxes of burnout. Okay, so this is where it gets counterintuitive because some of the findings in the research genuinely surprised me. The first is what I'd call the burnout but engaged paradox. Now, despite feeling burnt out, 88% of workers in one major study described themselves as highly or extremely engaged at work. And 44% said burnout actually made them more engaged, not less. So think about that for a second. Workers are coping with chronic stress by throwing themselves deeper into their work. That's not a sign of resilience, that's a warning sign. And it's a cycle that's very hard to break from the inside. The second concept I want to flag is something researchers are calling burn on. So this describes employees who haven't fully burnt out yet, but are chronically stressed to the point where their satisfaction and effectiveness are quietly deteriorating. They're functional, they're showing up, but they're running on empty. And because they haven't hit a wall, they often don't get any support. And the third paradox, which is particularly relevant for managers listening, is the perception gap. 68% of managers believe their team's well-being is the same or better compared to 12 months ago. Meanwhile, 45% of employees say their well-being has actually gotten worse. So that's a massive disconnect. And if managers don't know there's a problem, no intervention happens. Now we'll look at the Australian workplace context. So we'll zoom in specifically at what's happening in Australian workplaces because there are a few things worth calling out here. So the right to disconnect laws are an interesting case study. And when they were introduced, there was a lot of debate about whether they'd actually work or whether they'd just create more friction than benefit. But the early data is encouraging. So 58% of employers reported improved productivity and employee engagement after implementation. And a third saw drops in staff stress levels and improvements in overall well-being. So that's a meaningful result. On the clinical side, the Black Dog Institute has developed a digital CBT-based program called Navigating Burnout, specifically for Australian health professionals, and a randomised controlled trial is currently underway. The fact that one of our most respected mental health research bodies is dedicating resource to this tells you something about how seriously the medical community is taking burnout as a clinical issue. And coming back to the gender dimension in the Australian context, the combination of unpaid caring responsibilities at home, pay inequity at work, and the broader emotional load that falls disproportionately on women creates a specific kind of burnout risk that deserves its own conversation. We'll be coming back to that in a future episode. All right, so what do we actually do about this? So I'm going to split this into two levels. So what individuals can do and what organisations need to do. Because the answer is individual strategies alone are not enough. For an individual, start your day with meaningful high impact work, not your inbox, not low value admin. Research shows that building a sense of progress and momentum early in the day has a real protective effect against the kind of depletion that leads to burnout. Set boundaries around your communication and protect your recovery time as seriously as you protect your work time. This is increasingly important as constant notifications and digital connectivity drive what researchers are calling digital fatigue. You cannot recover if you're never fully offline. And know your warning signs. The research identifies 3 domains to watch for: emotional, so if you're feeling detached, cynical, or depleted; the cognitive, so difficulty concentrating, forgetfulness, reduced creativity; and the physical, so persistent fatigue, poor sleep, physical complaints like headaches or muscle tension. These often appear gradually, and by the time you notice them clearly, you're already well into the burnout territory. From an organisational perspective, these are some of the things to look out for. And I want to be really clear because this is where a lot of organisations are getting it wrong. A major 2025 systematic review found that the only interventions with sustained results, so that's beyond 3 months, are multi-level programs that combine individual support with organisational change. Brief workshops, no sustained effect. EAP hotlines that nobody calls, minimal impact unless paired with proper access to treatment. Ping pong tables, mindfulness apps and beanbags, not going to move the needle if the structural conditions are still broken. So what does work? So the research sort of breaks this down into 5 different areas. So 1, providing genuine stress management support. 2, giving employees real autonomy over how they do their work. 3, building social support and connection into the culture. 4, involving people in decisions that affect them. And 5, actually managing performance well, which means clear expectations, removing obstacles, and recognizing effort. And managers, this is on you too. Not because it's your fault, but because the research is clear that management quality is the single biggest differentiator when it comes to burnout. Not whether people are remote or in the office, it's not their age or their personality, it's how they are managed. So here's what I want to leave you with. Burnout is not a personal failing. It is not a sign that you're weak or that you can't handle pressure. The data makes that very clear. This is a systemic issue driven by structural conditions, pace of change, management gaps, and workplaces that are not designed with human sustainability in mind, which means the fixes need to operate at that level too. So yes, there are things that you can do as an individual to protect yourself. But the real levers is organisational change, and that requires people at every level, including those of us who don't sit in the C-suite, to name what's happening and advocate for workplaces that are actually sustainable. Here is one thing to try this week. Have one honest conversation with your manager, with a colleague, or even with yourself about what's depleting you and what one thing could change. Small shifts at scale that can move the needle. Thanks for listening. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. I'm Kate, and I'll see you next time.